afternoon, good evening, ladies and gents. It's a boy Casanova from Orlando, Florida, on this awesome international podcast, Good Wine and Great Laughs. I am your host, Casanova. Welcome to Casanova. And if you're new to my new YouTube channel, my YouTube channel is Good Wine and Great Laughs podcast. Is the podcast for wine lovers and hot topics, ladies and gents. Every Saturday morning, I will introduce you to a new wine. After I tasted the information of this wine, I'm going to watch some videos related to the topic of the day. And those topics are topics that can affect our lives directly or indirectly, ladies and gents. So if you like wine, if you like hot topics, please do me a favor, click on the like button every time I watch my videos. Subscribe on my YouTube channel and send and share those videos with your friends. At least 10 of your friends. I appreciate your support. So let's jump on the wine of the day, ladies and gents. I have here a wine from Germany. It's called the Clean Slate. You can see right there. And this is a brand new bottle that I bought to record it because last Saturday I had the same wine as you can see by this bottle. I have to record it and do so many times that I've almost finished the whole bottle. And I was mad because I could not finish everything. The computer was acting stupid. So let's read the information about what this wine is all about. The state on the back label says Clean Slate is a 2022 Riesling wine. And according to the label, information states that the thin slate stones of our vineyards in the Moselle River Valley are critical factor in the crafting of the Riesling of exquisite balance. So precious are these stones that those which slip into the river are carefully carried back up to the treacherously steep vineyard slopes and returned to place, reflecting and retaining heat. The slate is essential to ripening grapes in this cool climate, developing the wine's fresh peach, crispy lime, and subtle mineral flavors. Alcohol percent of this wine, ladies and gentlemen, is 10.5. Once again, this wine is called the Clean Slate, a product of Germany, Moselle, Germany, ladies and gents. All right. Okie dokie. I love the bouquet of this wine. Ladies and gents, this is one of the type of white wine that I like it. You definitely can feel in the back of your palate. It's a very, very subtle taste of peach, but you have more taste of the lime in the back of your palate. I like that. And also, the sweetness of this wine for me is perfect. It's not too sweet. I don't like very sweet wine. Not about that life, but this for me is perfect. I love it, I recommend it, and I give a 10 for this wine bottle, ladies and gents. So it's going to be on my social media like I always do. Every Saturday I posted the picture of on my Instagram, on my Facebook, as well on my LinkedIn page. It's available for you. If you want to take a look at it in the picture, take to the wine store. If you like to take it, go ahead. And if you drink any of the wine that I always recommend, ladies, please do me a favor. Make a comment over here or go to one of my social medias under the picture. Make a comment and let me know what you think about the wine of today. So, the topic of the day for the season 9, episode 9, is the Missouri governor denied clemency to the innocent inmate Marcellus Williams, ladies and gents. We're going to watch a couple of videos while I keep drinking this wine, ladies and gents, related to the whole story, the case, and also after his death, what happened with the interview with his lawyer. So, it is showtime.
You're looking at an innocent man currently awaiting execution. 7 years ago, the DNA on the murder weapon was finally tested and proved it was not his.
Whoever handled this knife left DNA. It is not Marcellus Williams.
His execution was stayed by the then governor, and a panel was convened to reassess his conviction.
Today, a panel will work to decide if that evidence proves Williams is innocent.
So, why is he still here?
How innocent do you have to be to avoid being executed?
This is an injustice, it's wrong. The evidence shows my dad is innocent.
The closer you get to execution, the stranger things get.
This interview remains the only one Marcellus has been able to give on camera from death row.
Right now, as you see, I'm sitting in prison on death row.
My friend Noah did it 6 years ago while working on a documentary about Marcellus' son's boxing career.
He's aspiring to be the champion. I believe that he feels that if given a chance, he will be the heavyweight champ.
I'm his only child, his son. I'm a professional fighter, but I've been fighting my whole life outside the ring.
Because of the fighting outside the ring, his boxing career was cut short, and as such, so was Noah's documentary. Fast forward 6 years later, Marcellus is still on death row. Noah comes to me with the work he's done so we can make this piece that you're watching right now. Noah gave me a rundown of what he was able to capture over the time he was working on his documentary.
Sat down with him for a few hours and just talked. And from there, just started diving in.
And then I flew to Missouri to follow up and to figure out what has been happening since he sat down with Marcellus. It's an unbelievable story that has to be heard, and one that is still hard to comprehend once you take it all in. It's one littered with stunning revelations and broken promises, and one that puts Missouri's years-long fight against overturning wrongful convictions directly in the spotlight. On August 11th, 1998, Felicia Gale, a 42-year-old former reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, was brutally murdered in her home in St. Louis, Missouri. She had been stabbed over 40 times. It mimicked a murder that had happened just 24 days before. Another woman, Deborah McLean, was murdered in her kitchen with a knife taken from the home, an eerily similar scene to Felicia Gale's murder. The investigation languished for months. Despite the similarities between the two murders, the knives being left at both scenes, there being bloody footprints in Gale's house, the police had little to go on. No eyewitnesses, no leads for either. Then, a year later, there was a break in the Gale case. It came in the form of a man named Henry Cole, a jailhouse informant who had said his cellmate had confessed to the murder. That eventually led to the arrest of Marcellus Williams, who was charged with Gale's murder. McLean's murder remains unsolved to this day, but Marcellus was in lockup, so he couldn't have done it. The case against Williams for Gale's murder was largely circumstantial.
This was a very brutal murder of a woman who was found in her home having been stabbed to death. There were bloody footprints at the crime scene, fingerprints, hairs found in the victim's hand, none of which matched Marcellus. Those were not his bloody footprints, those were not his hairs, and the fingerprints were destroyed.
The state's prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of two informants who had been incentivized to testify.
The only evidence they used to convict him is what we call incentivized informant testimonies. Individuals who came forward because they had something to gain.
The first was Cole.
So Marcellus had been in the workhouse, and someone who was incarcerated with him hears there's reward money and essentially says, I want this reward money and I want help with my own case, and says he won't even testify until he gets that reward money.
The second was Williams' former girlfriend, Laura Sorrow.
In addition, there's another individual, a woman who Marcellus was known to affiliate with. Notably, the two of them contradict each other in what they say would have happened and contradict physical evidence that's found at the crime scene.
The key piece of evidence brought against him was Gale's laptop, which he was said to have sold.
The last piece of evidence that they use is a laptop that had been taken from the victim's house that Marcellus did sell. But what wasn't presented at trial was that the woman that had come forward and said she had information and manufactured these statements about Marcellus is the person who gave him that laptop. And so it wasn't allowed to come out that really the only connection to the crime is this informant and not Marcellus Williams.
There were even eyewitnesses who had said they had seen Asaro with the laptop while Marcellus was still in county.
Usually in death penalty cases, the evidence of guilt is overwhelming, and the only real issue you can litigate in most cases is whether the death penalty was appropriately given. This case was different in that the evidence that they used to convict him was pretty thin and questionable.
All of this should have been easy to poke holes in for most attorneys, but these problems continued at trial. Since his conviction, Williams has argued in several motions that he received ineffective counsel during the trial, which came from a public defender assigned to him. It's no secret that America's public defender system has been stretched to its breaking point, but nowhere near as much as Missouri, which ranks 49th in the country in spending on indigent defenses. In 2017 alone, 320 public defenders handled 80,000 cases in the state of Missouri. The state has repeatedly vetoed bills that would supply funding to help alleviate this caseload.
The Missouri State Public Defender System is asking for more taxpayer money. They say thousands of defendants are on waiting lists because the office does not have enough attorneys to represent them.
It leaves people like Williams with inadequate counsel and inevitable outcomes like wrongful convictions.
Preparing a case for trial takes hundreds of hours if done properly. And if not done properly, then we end up with all these wrongful convictions.
At jury selection, Marcellus ended up with a mostly white jury when the prosecution struck 6 of the 7 qualified black jurors. When the trial was over, despite the questionable witnesses and the evidence being all circumstantial, they deliberated for less than 90 minutes before finding him guilty. There's something in the U.S. judicial system called a Batson challenge that is supposed to prevent the prosecution from striking qualified jurors on the sole ground of group bias. In this case, race. This was a black man being tried by an almost entirely white jury for a white woman's death in Missouri in the 1990s. When Marcellus' defense tried to argue Batson in a 2003 motion, the state indicated that the jurors were struck because the prosecution stated their clothing indicated they were trying to be different. But that was reason enough and not racially motivated, so Batson didn't apply. For years, Marcellus pleaded his innocence. His case was taken up by multiple different legal teams who fought tooth and nail to finally get the DNA that they had found on the knife properly tested. It turned out to be another man's profile.
There is a DNA testing statute in the Missouri law, but it's real narrowly written, so we just had to make that request in a broader claim of that he was innocent, or there's enough doubts about his innocence that he shouldn't be executed, and we can prove it if you let us do this further DNA testing.
It's not always a weapon like in Marcellus's case where it's left in the victim's body. That's a incredibly obvious piece of evidence. To know that wasn't tested was just shocking. It just blew my mind. Don't you think you should test it before you execute this man? Went through the evidence. I produced my analysis, which was pretty simple. There was a clear male profile on the handle, not Marcellus Williams. To me, that seemed sufficient to reopen the case.
This went on for months without any movement. No evidentiary hearings, no chance to present this new evidence. Then, at the last minute, just hours before his execution, the Governor Eric Greitens decided to stay his execution.
Marcellus Williams would be dead tonight without Governor Eric Greitens issuing a stay of execution.
Marcellus remembers that day.
I was like maybe a couple of hours away from being executed. I actually seen the execution team go into the little room, with their little materials. I had already came to grips with that.
In staying the execution, Greitens cited the new DNA evidence and assigned a board of retired judges to convene and make a decision on if Marcellus deserved a new trial.
Governor Greitens will appoint 5 retired judges to the panel to review Marcellus Williams' case, including that new DNA evidence.
Everyone was hopeful.
It's looking way better than it was before. Anything better than him facing death penalty. So now he getting the chance and the shot he needed for them to look over the DNA evidence.
But this sentiment was short-lived because what happened following that was nothing short of stunning. The board of inquiry is something unique to the state of Missouri. It's a law that's been rarely invoked, and each of the few times it has yielded bizarre results. In the late 90s, the then Governor Mel Carnahan issued a stay of execution and invoked the board of inquiry to look into the case of William Theodore Boliak Jr. Carnahan then died in a plane crash, and because of the wording in his stay, Boliak remains on death row to this day, with his execution being forever stayed. In Marcellus's case, the board of inquiry that then Governor Eric Greitens requested to convene did in fact meet, It was the first movement in a while and gave him and his legal team hope.
Are you hopeful now with this board required?
I'm hopeful, but I don't believe or trust in the judicial system. But I'm hopeful that some good will come out of it one way or another. And I'll just leave it at that.
Marcellus's hesitation here, born of a lengthy and complicated legal process that had kept him behind bars for years, proved to be prescient. This hope was indeed short-lived because as the board began to meet, something happened.
Missouri Republican Governor Eric Greitens, once considered a rising star in the GOP, has just resigned this afternoon amid an impeachment effort sparked by a pair of scandals.
Today, I am announcing that I will resign as governor of Missouri, effective Friday, June 1st at 5 p.m.
When former Missouri Governor Eric Greitens issued that stay, he impaneled a special board to examine the facts of the case and make a recommendation. But then a personal scandal forced Greitens out, leaving the board in jeopardy and the future of Marcellus Williams entirely unclear.
The governor who succeeded Greitens, Mike Parson, came in as someone tough on crime, which caused many to believe the board was in jeopardy.
I remember CBS coming into town saying, what's going to happen with Marcellus Williams? Will you keep the Board of Inquiry still intact? And he said, I'm going to let them do what Greitens set them up to do.
I know the board was canceled. Will they meet? Will they make a recommendation to you? And what will you do then?
I would assume they would. I heard they're not going to. So I think once they make that recommendation, if they do meet, then we'll discuss that at the time.
And now we found that that's not the case.
Parson, of course, dissolved the board, ending the state's years of work towards Marcellus obtaining a hearing. After everything Marcellus had been through, for his case to once again be thrown into turmoil for things outside of his control seemed unbelievable. How did the scandal-plagued governor of Missouri's resignation essentially ruin Marcellus's chances at freedom? The funny thing about Parson's tough on crime stance and these actions are that they only seem to apply to certain people in certain cases, further confounding how justice works within the state of Missouri. Parson has been granting pardons and clemency at an exceptional rate, more than any governor of Missouri since the 1940s. But this has a specific political tint to it. Parson's clemency only comes for people like Mark and Patricia McCloskey, the couple who became famous for waving guns at Black Lives Matter protesters.
Missouri Governor Mike Parson's office confirms his recent group of pardons and commutations include Mark and Patricia McCloskey. The St. Louis couple made national headlines last summer when they waved guns at demonstrators in their Central West End neighborhood.
As of August 2022, 90% of Parson's pardons have been white petitioners, which when you look at the demographics of those incarcerated in the state seems nearly impossible. For those outside of Parson's purview, the justice system seems to lean its full weight on them. Parson dissolved the board of inquiry looking into Marcellus's case and took no further action.
We filed a civil lawsuit saying we don't believe the governor has the authority to dissolve that board because he had to wait until they finished their work. Once they finished their work, he could do what he wanted with his clemency powers, but the order had already been there. Unfortunately, the Missouri Supreme Court disagreed with that and recently dismissed that civil case. And at that point, the Attorney General argued there was no other reason that an execution date shouldn't be set.
We're here now, and he's got a September execution date.
All of this speaks to how baffling the system in the state of Missouri is.
Missouri is one of the more difficult legal systems to navigate, in particular because of the opposition that every innocence case has faced.
Even when clear and convincing evidence emerges in a case, overturning a wrongful conviction here is an uphill battle.
I had a case, it wasn't a death row case, where the guy, to the two witnesses who identified him as killing this guy, both recanted their stories. We tried to get it back in front of the trial court here in Kansas City. The state opposed it, and the judge said, I can't hear this, denied, and he's still in prison. We're still trying to get him out.
The appeals process in the United States is already a lengthy and complicated one, but in Missouri it is especially tough. There's strict filing deadlines, limited resources for post-conviction investigations, procedural barriers, restrictive criteria for DNA testing, and a high bar for introducing new evidence.
You can have a winning case and the court won't hear it because of a procedural default. And that happens time and time again. It's happened in Missouri numerous times. The guys have been executed without really any meaningful review of their cases because of that.
All of these hurdles have directly hindered Marcellus Williams' pursuit of the truth.
In Marcellus's case, we were not necessarily defaulted on a lot of stuff, but we were thwarted at every turn in trying to get court authorization to get access to evidence that could exonerate him.
Procedurally and legally, the state of Missouri is set up in a way that continually thwarts attempts to seek justice. But the power the Attorney General holds in the state further complicates things and leads to horrific situations that honestly shocked me the further I went down the rabbit hole. The Attorney General's office in the state of Missouri has fought tooth and nail against every appeal and every hearing in the last several decades.
When they fight it, they fight to just prevent a hearing from even happening. And that's what we see time and time again, this argument of finality over fairness. We just need to be done, and not that we just need to get it right. When you have an office that takes these really hardline approaches, there's not a lot of room for the facts or justice in those cracks in between.
Combined with the laws the state has enacted over these years, it has caused so many problems for those arguing wrongful convictions.
If you've got evidence that you got an unfair trial, or if you got or wrongfully convicted, it shouldn't matter that there's a procedural problem in the case. The court ought to hear it.
Just a few weeks ago, the AG's office blocked the release of Christopher Dunn, who had served 30 years for a crime he didn't commit.
Our top story, he was just minutes away from walking free. The 11th hour move by the Missouri Supreme Court, halting the release of Christopher Dunn.
A circuit court judge overturned his conviction on the basis that both eyewitnesses had recanted their stories. Dunn was set to be released, only to have Missouri's current AG, Andrew Bailey, block it through the Missouri Supreme Court.
On Monday, a St. Louis Circuit Court judge overturned his conviction, but Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey appealed his release. On Wednesday, that same judge overruled Bailey, but just as Dunn was about to get out, the Missouri Supreme Court halted it per Bailey's request. Kira says she doesn't understand why AG Bailey is fighting it so hard.
All of this takes courage, and it's rare. And to see another part of the state try to slap that down and try to kill it, I just don't understand it.
This comes just a week after Bailey attempted the same thing with Sandra Hemme, the longest-held wrongly incarcerated woman known in the U.S. Hemme's conviction was overturned only to have her release blocked by Bailey. Eventually, he was overruled and she was set free. In the wake of it, her attorney Sean Bailey said it shouldn't be this hard to free an innocent person.
It's just going to show how bad the system needs to be reformed. It is broken. Absolutely.
A judgment was made 35 days ago. She was innocent, but Attorney General Andrew Bailey fought her release in the courts until the judge ordered her release by 6 p.m. or he would hold the Attorney General in contempt.
Despite his conviction being overturned, Dunn remained behind bars because of the Attorney General's petitions.
We are overjoyed, and at the same time, we're also afraid to really exhale until Chris actually takes his first free steps.
The human cost of these systematic failures is staggering. Collectively, Missouri's exonerees have served hundreds of years behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. Families have been torn apart, lives derailed, and the true perpetrators were left to commit further crimes.
She says no family should have to go through what Christopher's family went through yesterday. She says tonight they are waiting and trying to keep hope as this entire legal process continues to play out.
Marcellus' son knows all too well about this pain and the waiting, the keeping hope, the lengthy legal processes.
My dad in this f***ed up situation, I'm really got to be there for him. You know, so you got to let your dad know you love him. You know, get somebody their roses while they're still alive. These people want to put all the pressure. They make the visits uncomfortable. They make the lawyers run around in circles. You know what I'm saying? It's just too much.
Some studies indicate that 4 to 6% of the inmate population in America is actually innocent, which would mean that there could be hundreds more in Missouri behind bars for a crime they didn't commit. For a state that incarcerates its population at a rate higher than the national average and higher than most countries in the world, it needs to be sure it's getting these convictions right. Instead, it spent years railing against policies that would alleviate the problem and refuses to acknowledge any wrongdoing.
These people play games when they don't want to admit they wrongdoing. So It's the same story, new day, new book, you know, same shit, man.
The one strange thing Marcellus has on his side in this fight for innocence is doing it from death row.
Missouri is the only state in the country where if you can prove your innocence, you can get out of prison, but only if you were sentenced to death. So if you can prove your innocence and you were not sentenced to death, the courts essentially say we don't have any authority to do that.
In the 2016 ruling of Lincoln v. Cassidy by the Missouri Supreme Court, the court decided that freestanding claims of actual innocence, where a person asserts they are factually innocent of the crime for which they were convicted, even if there were no procedural errors in the trial, are only recognizable for individuals on death row. The decision effectively closed off a crucial avenue for potentially innocent prisoners serving non-death sentences to challenge their convictions based solely on new evidence of their innocence.
In 2016, the Court of Appeals in Missouri said it didn't matter essentially how strong the evidence of innocence was. The Missouri Supreme Court had only found innocence in a death penalty case, not in any other case, and so it did not have the power to overturn Rodney's conviction because he was not sentenced to death. That is still essentially the law today. Many individuals, myself included, have asked the Missouri Supreme Court to rehear this. They have declined to do so. And so what we see in cases like Rodney's or others in individuals is there's a very distinct partition between when we will hear evidence of innocence and when we won't.
The ruling in Lincoln v. Cassidy has had far-reaching consequences, as seen in cases like Christopher Dunn's, where compelling evidence of innocence exists but cannot be fully considered by the courts due to this precedent. For Marcellus, despite the fact he can present these freestanding claims of innocence, it has done little to help his case. It embodies every aspect of this broken justice system, and these failures very well could end in the execution of an innocent man. It's been 7 long years since the lab finally properly tested the DNA on the murder weapon found in Felicia Gale and proved it was not Marcellus Williams. It has been 7 long years since Marcellus Williams' lawyers have been seeking an evidentiary hearing to present this bombshell. And it has been 7 long years of the state of Missouri fighting this revelation like it has every other case.
Why not have the hearing, right? And the Attorney General's office has currently filed a motion to dismiss the prosecutor's motion to vacate, arguing that since an execution date has been set, it's too late, can't have a hearing.
Finally, after the execution date was set, the state decided it would allow an evidentiary hearing for the DNA evidence. Then, the AG, Andrew Bailey, filed a writ of probation to dismiss the hearing. The court rejected this, and the hearing will still proceed on August 21st, but not for lack of trying.
What's so disturbing about what's happening in Marcellus's case is that we have in January a prosecutor filing a motion to overturn his conviction on the basis of his innocence in January, and then just 6 months later, an execution date being set before a hearing on that motion has been held.
It's a very real possibility that because of the speed in which the courts work, that the results of the evidentiary hearing will not be known until after Marcellus Williams is executed on September 24th.
There's no coming back from an execution. And where there's DNA evidence and a prosecutor saying, I want a hearing on this DNA evidence because I believe this person is innocent, to not have that hearing, to just say it's too late, would really say something about what it means to try to seek justice in our system.
Beyond the convincing DNA evidence, the ineffective counsel, the contradicting eyewitnesses, something else has come to light. Notably, while Noah was making his documentary, a private investigator had spoken with Asaro before she had passed and said she had recanted her story, saying Marcellus had nothing to do with the murder.
Somebody was following Laura Asaro before she passed, but apparently she said he didn't do it.
It sounds to me like she said twice he didn't do it.
She died before they could get a sworn affidavit.
They tried to get an affidavit to her, and she passed before she could.
Even in spite of all that, all the other evidence in this case that points to Marcellus Williams' innocence should lead to his exoneration, or at least a new trial, but only time will tell if that happens. The governor of Missouri's AG will fight this case to the bitter end, and even if his conviction is overturned, they could block his release from prison, like they did Christopher Dunn and Sandra Hemme. Of course, on top of all this are the ethics of the death penalty, which are for another time.
Doesn't matter where someone stands on the death penalty here. If we want to have that system, there has to be the possibility for somebody to have their innocence heard before a step is taken that can never be undone.
This entire journey has disillusioned me on the justice system's approach to wrongful convictions, and even more so on Missouri's fight for finality over fairness. but has also taught me that if a case gets enough attention, it very well could mean life or death for the person at the center.
He a good man, he an honorable man, and he an innocent man. So that's that.
On this particular day, if I seem a bit melancholy, if not downright sad, it's because of where we're getting started with some news out of Missouri, the state of Missouri, where the state executed a man whose murder conviction was questioned by a number of people, including the prosecutor himself. The victim's family also pushed for the man to not be executed. I'm talking about Mr. Marcellus Williams, who was 55 years of age, who died by lethal injection yesterday around 6 p.m. Central Time. He was convicted in 2001 of killing Felicia Gale, a former newspaper reporter found stabbed to death in her home in 1998. Williams' case drew national headlines as his attorneys appealed the conviction based on what they described as new evidence that included alleged bias in jury selection and contamination of the murder weapon prior to the trial. The family of Felicia Gale even asked that Williams be spared death. However, the U.S. Supreme Court denied the stay of execution yesterday, a day after Missouri's Supreme Court and Governor Mike Parson refused to grant a stay as well. The Supreme Court offered no explanation for its decision. However, in the third appeal, Justices Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson all said they would have granted the request to pause the execution. Before his death, Williams wrote a final handwritten statement seen here that reads, quote, "All praise be to Allah in every situation," end quote. This is a very alarming situation. And as far as I'm concerned, any human being should speak out against it, but especially if you're black. This black man was murdered yesterday.
Right.
Let's call it what it is. It's murder.
Absolutely.
There's no excuse for it. And I'm going to tell you why. If there's DNA evidence that contradicts what prosecutors asserted that led to a conviction, that's a valid point to stay in execution. If the prosecutor himself, herself, themselves acknowledge that based on evidence that can now be refuted, there should be a stay of execution. That's another reason not to execute the man. If a former governor, as in Governor Eric Greitens, Greitens, Eric Greitens, he is the predecessor of Governor Mike Parson. He granted Williams a reprieve. He was persuaded by arguments that new DNA evidence, new DNA testing exonerated Williams. He did that years ago. Remember, Williams was twice spared from execution, first by the state Supreme Court in 2015 and then in 2017. So let's get this straight. Governor Parsons is ignoring a ruling by the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court from 9 years ago. He's ignoring a ruling by his predecessor from 7 years ago. He's ignoring prosecutors. He's ignoring DNA evidence. And on top of it all, the victim's family didn't want him executed. Now, according to reports, and I'm about to speak to somebody to find out whether or not they can verify this or not, the victim's family was against capital punishment no matter what. But nevertheless, look at that preponderance of evidence. Think about that for a second here. Think about the kind of stuff that we're talking about. How could you possibly justify executing this man? To this day, we don't have a justifiable explanation from Governor Parson. Because the board that was supposed to investigate the matter and hand down a ruling was something that was disbanded by him. Did you just want to kill a black man? I mean, it's a legitimate question to be asked. Is it all right that you just murdered him? Is it okay that he was potentially innocent and you didn't give a damn because the word potential doesn't matter to you? What was it? What was it? I mean, you talk about some nonsense right here. This is why we have a country that's so divided. This is why we have a country that looks at things in two different ways, because you can't come together on a damn thing. Who can't come together on this? When you got a prosecutor, when you have evidence, when you have a former governor, when you have the state Supreme Court, all giving a ruling in favor of staying in execution, and you still say, bump that, the man dies, and have him killed by the state via lethal injection in front of his family, when the man proclaimed his innocence and stayed that way for over 20 years, and you do it anyway. You don't give a shit.
Right.
You don't care. I'm not one of these people, ladies and gentlemen, that's diametrically opposed to capital punishment. I'm one of those people, depending on how heinous the crime, and it's finite and definitive that you are guilty, particularly if no contrition or no remorse was shown, I have no problem with you dying. Zero. But only under those conditions. If there's a scintilla of doubt, you don't do what Governor Parson did. And to do something like that, and to make this decision, it's criminal. It is an absolute crime. And I can't even tell you how sad I am for Marcellus Williams' family, because he went to his death proclaiming his innocence. And he had an abundance of people and institutions supporting him. And the governor of Missouri didn't give a damn.
Exactly. It is a shame.
You might be able to sleep well at night right now, sir, because you appear to have no conscience. We'll see how long that lasts, and whether or not that truly comes back to haunt you someday. We'll see. Joining me now is Mr. Jonathan Potts, Marcellus Williams' attorney at the BCPL in St. Louis, who fought to stay his execution. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. Take us through the last 24 to 48 hours in your efforts to stay the execution of Mr. Williams, please.
Yeah, there's been pretty much a knife fight that went on over the past 48 hours or so. We were filing briefs over the weekend with the Missouri Supreme Court, arguing it on Monday morning, and then trying to get the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case. Ultimately, they declined, and Mr. Williams was executed last night at about 6 p.m.
Who was in attendance for his execution?
There were two members from our legal team, as well as Mr. Williams' son, Marcellus Jr., who were there to witness it.
Any members from the victim's family in attendance?
No.
Why did they not show up? Are you aware of the reasoning that they had, or a reasoning that they gave for not being in attendance?
No, I don't know why they weren't there. I can imagine it's emotionally trying for them too. But the important thing to remember is that the victim's family was not in favor of executing Mr. Williams.
And why did they reach a conclusion that they were not in favor of this execution, specifically?
From the beginning, they were honoring the wishes of the victim. I want to be clear, Mr. Williams is innocent, but the victim's family has always said that no matter what happened, the victim would not have wanted anyone to be executed. Her husband didn't want anyone to be executed, and her family didn't want anyone to be executed.
The prosecutor, if I remember correctly, had a change of thinking, and they were ultimately ended up being against the execution. Is that correct? And if so, what was their reasoning and rationale behind it?
Yeah, it's even more than them just being against the execution. They were fighting to overturn the execution. We were having a trial last month where it wasn't even our team, the defense team, who filed it, but it was a new lawsuit filed by the prosecutor saying that this was an unfair and unconstitutional trial and that Mr. Williams' execution needed to be stopped.
And they felt that it needed to be they needed the execution to be stopped because they believed that there was evidence that contradicted the guilty verdict?
Absolutely. So from the beginning, there was forensic evidence that pointed away from Mr. Williams. There were bloody footprints at the scene that didn't belong to him, didn't belong to the husband, didn't belong to the first responders. There was other forensic evidence at the scene pointing away. We found new DNA evidence on the murder weapon that didn't belong to Mr. Williams. And what further testing showed is that the DNA on the knife belonged to the original trial prosecutor 20 years ago, and he had contaminated the evidence. And it frankly prevented us from being able to find the DNA, whoever was the real killer.
In what way was the evidence contaminated?
We put the trial prosecutor from 20 years ago on the stand last month, and we cross-examined them. And he admitted that not once, not twice, but 5 times before trial, he had handled the murder weapon, which was a bloody kitchen knife, without gloves. He had been showing it to witnesses, just holding it, putting his DNA all over it, and potentially wiping away any DNA from the actual killer.
And still, they went ahead with the execution. What rationale did the governor give for not pardoning him, or for not staying this execution, or anybody else for that matter?
The governor just said that he'd received due process and a decision had been made. And we obviously strongly disagree with that. He didn't receive due process. What we also learned at the hearing last month is that the trial prosecutor admitted that he got rid of at least one juror, in part because he's black. It was a devastating thing to hear. And that alone should have stopped the execution, but it didn't.
He got rid of one juror because the juror was black?
That is correct, Stephen. What he said, I asked him when he was on the stand, and I said, you got rid of the juror because he was a young black man with glasses? And he said, wrong. That was part of the reason. It was because he also had piercing eyes.
Wow. I'm thinking about the predecessor to the governor that's in office right now, and how his predecessor decided to stay the execution years ago. So this governor didn't take that into consideration, evidently. And I'm wondering why that was the case. Again, I know I'm being a bit redundant in asking that question, but I find myself feeling a bit incredulous and just taken aback significantly by the fact that there was a preponderance of evidence. You've got a prosecutor that no longer supported the execution. You got the victim's family that didn't want the execution. You got DNA evidence that was compromised. You have a predecessor to the governor that's presently in office who stayed the execution, but somehow, some way, this governor decided to still go forward.
Yes, Stephen, the breadcrumbs are all there. I think any person who is following this case knows exactly what happened. And we received an outpouring of public support. Basically, everyone that we've heard from has been against the execution, except for the governor and the Missouri Attorney General. And I want to point out that what actually happened is that the prior governor stopped a prior execution just minutes before it was about to happen to appoint a special board to look into Mr. Williams' case. And then what happened is that Governor Parson actually disbanded that board before it ever gave him a recommendation about whether to give Mr. Williams a pardon or commutation of his sentence. Basically, he didn't hear the answer.
What was his explanation for disbanding that board?
Didn't give one.
He didn't give one?
Yeah, I think enough time had passed and wasn't very interested in what he was going to hear.
How many executions have taken place in the state of Missouri in recent memory?
I believe that there are 3 executions this year, and I think it's 11 executions under the current governor.
Under the current governor. How many of them have been black? Do you have an answer to that question?
I don't know off the top of my head, Stephen, but your guess is probably a good one.
And where do you guys go from here? What have you learned, or what do you take from a case such as this? Because it has to be very debilitating, very, very depressing, to be quite honest with you, to know that such a preponderance of evidence has been put in your favor to stay in execution, and you have the support, the inordinate amount of support that you received, and still the execution went through. It has to be incredibly disheartening, one would imagine.
It's more than disheartening. You know, we obviously cared quite a bit about Mr. Williams. When someone's your client for many years, and you're working to try and save their life, it carries a very, very heavy emotional toll. And when you see that person put to death under unfair circumstances, you start to have doubts about the integrity of the judicial system. The important thing, though, is the reason that we take these cases on is we are trying to build back public trust in the judicial system. And the only way that you build back public trust is when that system is willing to admit its errors. Right now, the system wants to say, pretend the errors didn't happen. People don't believe that. Everyone knows mistakes are made. The only way that you're going to have the public believe that they're getting a fair trial is when you admit that a mistake was made, and you admit that mistake, you fix it, and you promise that it's never going to happen again. And that's not what happened here.
I'm thinking about the prosecutor admitting their mistake. I'm thinking about the preponderance of evidence that ultimately favored you staying the execution. And I'm thinking also about Governor Mike Parson, because that's his name, Mike Parson, literally not providing an explanation really as to why he was dogged in his decision to execute Mr. Williams. I think that what's incredibly alarming outside of the actual killing itself, please don't get me wrong, is the fact that the governor hasn't been required to give an in-depth explanation as to why he reached the decision that he reached.
There was a board that was appointed for that specific purpose. They conducted an investigation for 6 years, and they were going to provide him with a report and a recommendation. And like I said, he dissolved that board before their work was complete.
And by dissolving that board, they can't give us an explanation because they're in no position to do so. And he refuses to give an explanation because he's in a position as the governor to do just that. That's the only thing that any of us can surmise. Is that correct, Jonathan?
Yeah, it's up to Governor Parson whether he wants to explain that.
What does that leave the BCLP moving forward? I mean, when you talk about the reason for your existence is restoring faith, to have a situation where you have so much evidence in your favor and still come up short in staying this execution, where does that leave you moving forward?
So here's the thing, Stephen. I'm a sports lawyer. What I've been doing in these cases is this is something that I do pro bono. In my career so far, we've exonerated 3 people murder. And Mr. Williams, unfortunately, was executed last night. But we are doing this because we are trying to bring faith back to the community in terms of understanding that the court system is there to protect us. And the important thing isn't that you get it over with, but that you get it right. And I want people to know that we are going to keep fighting to make sure that people don't get executed for crimes that they don't commit. And I worry about our kids. I worry about each other. And you worry about whether we really have our values properly aligned when we want to just kill someone because it's been too long and he's been sitting around on death row for 20 years, so we need to get it over with.
Wow. Jonathan Potts, I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining the show. And I'm really, really sorry for what the outcome ultimately ended up being. It certainly wasn't due to a lack of effort and due diligence and expertise on your part and that of the BCLP. I can assure you of that. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
And ladies and gents, as you watch this 2 videos with me, I don't know how you are feeling, but through the whole first video and the second, my heart and just my inside was just like was removing. It's just like personally I hate injustice. And I agree 100% with Mrs. Stephen A. Smith. I truly believe in my life, one thing that I live my life is I focus on the law of physics. The law of physics states for every action, there is a reaction. For instance, if Mr. Marcellus Williams was the killer, he deserved what he got to be all those years in jail. And at the end, he ended up being executed. You do the crime, you do the time. It has been proven with plenty of evidence that you are the perpetrator of that crime. You are the killer. You took an innocent life that was minding her own business, living her best life inside her own home. You invaded, you robbed it, you killed it, you did atrocity with that body, and you deserve to go to the being executed, point and blank. And I agree with what Stephen said. Now, if the man from the get-go, from the selection of the jury, from the evidence that was presented, that completely exonerated, Marcellus Williams, and also the witness that came and said something that I saw that because he has a motive. His motive was give the reward, because you saw in the first video, give him that money before I testify. And at the time, I believe it was $10,000. Back in 1989 or 99, whatever the time was a lot of money. Today, nowadays, $10,000 it is a lot of money. Think about back in the days when the crime, happened. And shame, nothing but shame to Governor Mike Person, because this man gave a lot of pardons. He's on the record that on the state of Missouri that gave him more pardons than everybody. But who he gave the pardons to? White people. White people and rich white people, especially that couple that was showing their weapons to the Black Lives Matter protested in Missouri. You know what I'm saying? And the judge and the whole system. And one thing that now Mr. Jonathan Potts, the lawyer of Marcellus Williams, they say to restore the integrity of the judicial system. Now, I did my search, and I found out that Mr. Michael Person, the governor of Missouri, is a Republican. All right? Now, the Republicans always claim that the party, they're the Christian party, they're the party of the family values, right? And all the judges, that's why it's important. I say this all the time. You may not like politics, you may not enjoy it, but politics is a necessary evil, because most of the judges, state and federal, are appointed by the governor or the president or are elected. So that's why it's important. There's election coming up. So what I did already, I already did my search. Here in Florida, you have this website called the Blue Guide. Yes, I believe it's theblueguide.com. There you can put your zip code, and it's going to tell you all the candidates. And another thing is important, because in this election, especially here in Florida, there's a bunch of judges and all the positions that is not being publicized too much. So you're not going to vote for Kamala Harris and to the senator, here Rick Scott and the Democrat candidate. There's a couple of amendments that's legalizing marijuana and also the right to abortion here. So there's a bunch of amendments that all the stuff's in the ballot that is going to be there. So I encourage you now, that has chance for you to do your search and look to the right candidates. That's why it's important to vote, because now we have this piece of crap, Michael Person, the Attorney General, the Supreme Court, the Missouri Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court, that 6 of the justices, completely ignore. Now, all these people going to church on Sunday, right? And one thing that I know about the Almighty is this, we are going to reap what we sow on this earth. It's just a matter of time. Maybe somebody that's corrupt, that is doing all his duties under the table and never being give account about it or getting caught. He lived his whole life under the radar by doing his dirty. But one day, that person will die. We all will die. And my trust, my beliefs in life that you're going to give account. You're going to give account for everything where we did on this earth. Like, Stephen A. Smith say, it's coming to you, sir. It's a matter of time. On this earth, on this life, or the next. You have blood. You burn out the AG, the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court. You all have Marcellus blood in your hands. Because the government has the authority, the power to sign the clemency and let the man go because it has DNA evidence. And one thing that's really, really bad for me is because they know the man is innocent, but they try to do everything to keep this man in jail and to execute him. So we may not know Marcellus Williams. I don't know him. I heard about his story when I was coming up. But it could happen with me. It could happen with you, your brother, your sisters, your homeboy. You never know. So just because you do not know Marcellus, Mr. Marcellus Williams, it doesn't mean that you should be worried about it, that you or somebody that you love and care about could be next to end up getting caught on the bad situation, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, end up being caught on this. So this, ladies and gents, is important to vote and to get rid of all these corrupt people and the positions that can affect your life directly or indirectly. Not you, not me, or also somebody that you love. So ladies and gents, that's my 2 cents for this episode. So please be safe, be kind, and be blessed, and do the best what you can do to what you got. Salute. And I see you next Saturday with another awesome episode of Good Wine and Good Claps. Holla!